the patriarchy tries to attack the woman, it's always, you know what, this man looks very. I'm not surprised that rather than recognizing Harry's own strength and his own opinion, they want to blame Meghan as the woman who is, you know, who's put a leash around his neck. It's utter nonsense. You and I know better. We know exactly what game they're playing. All I'm going to say is let's keep applauding Harry and Meghan. They're getting it right. Ain't nothing wrong with what they're doing.
Dr. Shola, thank you so much for talking to us. Dr. Shola Shogbamimu there, talking about the latest from Harry and Meghan. I'm sure you've got a view on that. 85058, get them in now. We'll be crossing to Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, when he's ready to make that announcement about the economy. But before that, almost 300 years after the Witchcraft Act was repealed, different politics in a different time, a campaign is underway in Scotland for a pardon for the approximately 2,500 people, mostly women, who were burned at the stake for being witches. An application to the Scottish Parliament's Justice Committee for a pardon for those executed is expected to be lodged next year. Claire Mitchell QC is the woman behind the campaign, Witches of Scotland, and I asked her how a woman came to be labelled as a witch in the first place.
It certainly was not a difficult task. What happened was that when someone was accused of being a witch, it was usually by someone in their local community. The evidence that we see from looking at the documents, which we still have, shows that people accused their neighbours or their landlord, accused their tenants of doing things which they might have thought a bit out of the ordinary. It included not much. For example, one woman was simply seen late at night, and that was enough to give the suspicion arising that she might be in cahoots with evil forces. Other things, such as women having black cats, or indeed women speaking ill of someone and then that person becoming sick. Of course, the other thing that could happen is simply things would be completely made up. And unfortunately, when one woman was accused of being a witch, she would then suffer torture and be asked to confess who else was in the coven. So then stories may be made up just to stop the torture, or perhaps to see if they could get off the hook by saying names of other people. And perhaps I should say most commonly that when we were subject to this kind of torture, one of the is why we remember her. And looking at that, I thought there's actually even worse than that. It's not only isn't there a named woman, but in fact there isn't even any mention of the fact that hundreds of women would have met their death here. They would have been falsely accused of a miscarriage of justice as witches, and they would have been killed. So that's really when the two ideas came together of a miscarriage of justice for these women and the lack of visibility of any acknowledgement of that.
And we're talking about thousands of women burned at the stake.
Yes, the records, specifically the early records between the 16th and 18th century, are not good. There were 4 waves of witchcraft, broadly speaking, and that first wave isn't very well accounted for, but it is thought there were probably around 3,500 to 4,000 people accused of witchcraft, and of that it is thought that perhaps 2/3 were involved in being executed.
Why is it necessary, do you think, to do what you're doing here? Some could argue, what about the lives of women now, or other groups that need your help more?
Well, it's absolutely correct that people would want to flag up what about the lives of women now. That's actually one of the main aim of the Witches of Scotland campaign. There are women and children, for the most part, some men too, who are still being persecuted by way of calling them witches. So there are countries in the world where women, children and also men are being prosecuted, and the threat of witchcraft is being used. When I set up the campaign and had some publicity in the last sort of couple of weeks, I have been contacted, in particular one email that I received from a lawyer in a country where in parts of that country witchcraft is still used as a tool of persecution, and he's far from alone. There are places over the world where it's still used. So part of this campaign is to highlight the fact that this is still being used.
There you go. Claire Mitchell, QC there, behind that campaign of the Witches of Scotland. We're just going to interrupt that. There was a bit more to share, and perhaps we can do that a bit later in the programme, because Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, is due to give his winter economy plan and deliver that for us all to hear. We've been talking about it throughout the morning, and you've been getting in touch. He's unveiling his winter economy plan, and in it, we're expecting a German-style wage subsidy scheme that he hopes will be able to save jobs, or at least stave off mass redundancies. How it was understood to work is that the government is expected to subsidise the wages of employees who can work at least half of their normal hours. So this is what we're expecting to hear, and companies pick up the wages for hours covered by employees, and the government will pay a third of their wages while they aren't working, effectively topping up their salaries. So employers would pay another third and employees would forego a third. This is a way he has seen is the right way to respond right now to this crisis. We're also listening out to what's going to be, we think, an extension of the loan schemes available to businesses, and also possible further business rate reliefs for industries under particular duress, such as sports clubs. So those are some of the things we're expecting to hear in this winter economy plan. As you can imagine, he has been having to respond again to these further restrictions. Let's cross now to Rishi Sunak, to the Commons.
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for granting me permission to make this statement to the House today. Earlier this week, the Prime Minister set out the next stage of the government's health response to coronavirus. Today, I want to explain the next phase of our planned economic response. The House will be reassured to know I've been developing plans to protect jobs and the economy over the winter period. Plans that seek to strike the finely judged balance between managing the virus and protecting the jobs and livelihoods of millions. Mr. Speaker, I know people are anxious and afraid and exhausted at the prospect of further restrictions on our economic and social freedoms. I share those feelings, but there are reasons to be cautiously optimistic. We are in a fundamentally different position than we were in March, and we now know much more about this virus. Public awareness of the risks and how to mitigate them is far greater. And we have met our promise to give the NHS whatever it needs, with significant new funding for NHS capacity, for PPE, and I can inform the House today we have now provided over £12 billion for test and trace. In economic terms, while our output remains well below where it was in February, we have seen 3 consecutive months of growth, and millions of people have moved off the furlough and back to work. But the resurgence of the virus and the measures we need to take in response pose a threat to this fragile economic recovery. So our task now is to move to the next stage of our economic plan, nurturing the recovery by protecting jobs through the difficult winter months. Mr. Speaker, the underlying rationale for the next phase of economic support must be different to what came before. The primary goal of our economic policy remains unchanged: to support people's jobs. But the way we achieve that must evolve. Back in March, we hoped we were facing a temporary period of disruption. In response, we provided one of the most generous and comprehensive economic plans anywhere in the world, with £190 billion of support for people, businesses, and public services as we protected our economic capacity. It is now clear, as the Prime Minister and our scientific advisors have said, for at least the next 6 months, the virus and restrictions are going to be a fact of our lives. Our economy is now likely to undergo a more permanent adjustment. The sources of our economic growth and the kinds of jobs we create will adapt and evolve to the new normal. And our plan needs to adapt and evolve in response. Above all, we need to face up to the trade-offs and hard choices coronavirus presents. And Mr. Speaker, there has been no harder choice than the decision to end the furlough scheme. The furlough was the right policy at the time we introduced it. It provided immediate short-term protection for millions of jobs through a period of acute crisis. But as the economy reopens, it is fundamentally wrong to hold people in jobs that only exist inside the furlough. We need to create new opportunities and allow the economy to move forward. And that means supporting people to be in viable jobs which provide genuine security. As I've said throughout this crisis, I cannot save every business. I cannot save every job. No Chancellor could. But what we can and must do is deal with the real problems businesses and employees are facing now. In March, the problem was that we ordered businesses to close. In response, we paid people to stay at home and not work. Today, the problem is different. Many businesses are operating safely and viably, but they now face uncertainty and reduced demand over the winter months. What those businesses need is support to bring people back to work and protect as many viable jobs as we can. To do that, I'm announcing today the new Jobs Support Scheme. The government will directly support the wages of people in work, giving businesses who face depressed demand the option of keeping employees in a job on shorter hours rather than making them redundant. The Job Support Scheme is built on 3 principles. First, it will support viable jobs. To make sure of that, employees must work at least a third of their normal hours and be paid for that work as normal by their employer. The government, together with employers, will then increase those people's wages, covering 2/3 of the pay they have lost by reducing their working hours. And the employee will keep their job. Second, we will target support at firms who need it the most. All small and medium-sized businesses are eligible, but larger businesses only when their turnover has fallen through the crisis. Third, it will be open to employers across the United Kingdom, even if they have not previously used the furlough scheme. The scheme will run for 6 months, starting in November. And employers retaining furloughed staff on shorter hours can claim both the Job Support Scheme and the Jobs Retention Bonus. Mr. Speaker, throughout this crisis, we have sought parity between employees and the self-employed, providing more than £13 billion of support to over 2.6 million self-employed small businesses. So I am extending the existing self-employed grant on similar terms and conditions as the new Jobs Support Scheme. Mr. Speaker, these are radical interventions in the UK labour market, policies we have never tried in this country before. Together with the Jobs Retention Bonus, the Kickstart Scheme for young people, tens of billions of pounds of job creation schemes, new investment in training and apprenticeships, we are protecting millions of jobs and businesses. Mr. Speaker, if we want to protect jobs this winter, the second major challenge is helping businesses with cash flow. Over the last 6 months, we've supported business with tens of billions of pounds of tax deferrals and generous government-backed loans. Those policies have been a lifeline. But right now, businesses need every extra pound to protect jobs rather than repaying loans and tax deferrals. So I'm taking 4 further to survive this pandemic. To give those businesses more time and greater flexibility to repay their loans, we are introducing Pay As You Grow. This means loans can now be extended from 6 to 10 years, nearly halving the average monthly repayment. Businesses who are struggling can now choose to make interest-only payments, and anyone in real trouble can apply to suspend repayments altogether for up to 6 months. No business taking up Pay As You Grow will see their credit rating affected as a result. Second, I am also changing the terms of our other loan schemes. More than 60,000 small and medium-sized businesses have now taken out coronavirus business interruption loans. To help them, I plan to extend the government guarantee on these loans for up to 10 years, making it easier for lenders to give more people more time to repay. I am also extending the deadline of all our loan schemes to the end of this year. And we are starting work on a new successor loan guarantee programme set to begin in January. Third, I want to give businesses more time and flexibility over their deferred tax bills. Nearly 500,000 businesses deferred more than £30 billion of VAT this year. On current plans, those payments fall due in March. Instead, I will allow businesses to spread that VAT bill over 11 smaller repayments with no interest to pay. And any of the millions of self-assessed income taxpayers who need extra help can also now extend their outstanding tax bill over 12 months from next January. The final step I'm taking today will support 2 of the most affected sectors: hospitality and tourism. On current plans, their VAT rates will increase from 5% back to the standard rate of 20% on January the 13th. So to support more than 150,000 businesses and help protect 2.4 million jobs through the winter, I'm announcing today that we are cancelling the planned increase and will keep the lower 5% VAT rate until March the 31st next year. Mr. Speaker, today's measures mark an important evolution in our approach. Our lives can no longer be put on hold. Since May, we have taken steps to liberate our economy and society. We did these things because life means more than simply existing. We find meaning and hope through our friends and family, through our work, through our community. People were not wrong for wanting that meaning, for striving towards normality, and nor was the government wrong to want this for them. I said in the summer that we must endure and live with the uncertainty of the moment. This means learning our new limits as we go. Because the truth is, the responsibility for defeating coronavirus cannot be held by government alone. It is a collective responsibility shared by all, because the cost is paid by all. We have so often spoken about this virus in terms of lives lost. But the price our country is paying is wider than that. The government has done much to mitigate the effects of these awful trade-offs between health, education, and employment. And as we think about the next few weeks and months, we need to bear all of those costs in mind. As such, it would be dishonest to say there is now some risk-free solution, or that we can mandate behaviour to such an extent we lose any sense of personal responsibility. What was true at the beginning of this crisis remains true now. It's on all of us, and we must learn to live with it and live without fear. I commend this statement to the House.
Just to say, I recognise the importance of this statement, and quite rightly, you need a little more time. And just to show that, I'll ensure that the other two, not only the Shadow Chancellor, but the spokesperson as well, will have some extra time as well. Shadow Chancellor Annalise Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Chancellor for his statement and for advance sight of this announcement. Mr. Speaker, I've called for the introduction of a system of targeted wage support 40 times. That call has been rebuffed by this government 20 times. It's a relief this government have U-turned now. But we must be open and honest. That delay in introducing this new scheme will have impacted on businesses' confidence. I know that from talking to them, and I'm sure members on the opposite benches know that from talking to businesses in their constituencies. The deadline for redundancy consultations by large firms before the end of the furlough scheme came and went last week without a word from this government. Now, if the package of measures announced today can help people keep their jobs and can help businesses through hard times, then Labour will, of course, support it. And there's much in this statement that we do support. As I've just said, we've repeatedly called for a system of targeted wage support, and we've repeatedly called for help for indebted, cash-strapped businesses over and over again. But we must ensure these measures are as effective as possible at keeping workers in employment, getting unemployed people back into work, and keeping viable businesses in operation. Now, as with many previous announcements by this government, we must wait for the detail to be revealed, presumably following the press conference scheduled for later on today. But workers and businesses are hanging on the Chancellor's every word right now, and they need to know what's promised here. So can the Chancellor be clear? Will this scheme of wage support actually keep more people in work? Because for that to happen, the scheme must make it more attractive for employers to retain more staff on reduced hours than to retain some full-time and make others redundant. So does his scheme actually incentivise short hours working? What conditions, if any, will be applied to ensure value for public money? Will the scheme require commitments for continuing employment, unlike the existing furlough scheme where there have been abuses? And will it require those participating to provide decent, sustainable work? Will the scheme incentivise training and retraining? The German scheme does. And Labour's called for a UK version to include incentives for training, but that's missing here. Indeed, while, as I said, we welcome many of the elements the Chancellor has announced today, the lack of action on training and skills is worrying. I was waiting and waiting for the Chancellor to talk about training. He mentioned the word once in passing. That's not enough. His government has already allocated funding for a national skills strategy, but it's not being delivered on the ground. So when will the Chancellor get serious about training so people can be ready for the jobs? Plea for continued targeted support for the self-employed. So I'm pleased that's referred to here. But will these measures avoid the gaps in coverage that have bedevilled existing schemes? And why is there no forward plan here for the needs of those who are extremely clinically vulnerable to this disease? Relatedly, will the Chancellor do more to demand his colleagues get a grip on the UK's public health crisis? Because our country's suffering from a double tragedy. The highest excess death rate in Europe and the deepest recession in the G7. Labour supports the government in its announcement of additional restrictions this week. The government's messaging has been confused enough already. The last thing we want to do is add to that confusion. But we are concerned that these restrictions have only been necessary because of continuing problems with test, trace and isolate. Now, the Chancellor referred to the money that has been put into test, trace and isolate. As I said earlier this week, enormous sums have been devoted to that task, but those sums are not delivering the system that we need. We are still not at the stage of many other countries. The Chancellor must work on this as well as his other colleagues in government. Now, finally, before the summer recess, Labour called for a back-to-work budget focused on jobs, jobs, jobs. We didn't get one. We expected a budget this autumn. It appears again we're not getting one, and that's despite the challenges this poses for devolved governments, and despite the fact that government's actually referred to provisions in a future finance bill as necessary for its approach to Brexit. The Chancellor only announced he'd make a statement to Parliament today after I'd called for him to come here with an urgent question, and I'm very grateful to Mr. Speaker for granting that. Now, this government has lagged behind on test, trace and isolate. It's lagged behind on wage support. It's lagged behind on support for those having to self-isolate. It's lagging behind on green investment. And for these and for other reasons, it looks like our recovery will be lagging behind that of many other countries. So finally, when will the Chancellor provide the back-to-work budget this country needs? Thank you.
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member opposite for her comments. On the question of continued support for jobs, however, I would have hoped that she would have welcomed strongly today's measures, if for no other reason that she has previously asked for something similar. However, her position on this matter has been somewhat changeable, Mr. Speaker. At different points in the last few weeks and months, she has said that furlough shouldn't go on forever, and then changed her mind and said we should extend it. And then she changed her mind and said it should be replaced. And then only yesterday, the Leader of the Opposition said it should be extended again. That's not the kind of certainty that British businesses or British workers need. But to address the specific questions, Mr. Speaker, this scheme absolutely does incentivise shorter time working. The company will pay its workers for the time that they are in work, and the government and the employer jointly will subsidise the time of the worker is not working. The conditions will be set out in guidance, which will be published shortly, and then over the next few weeks, the further details will be worked through with businesses and unions, as we did with the furlough scheme. In terms of conditionality, I can reassure the Honourable Lady opposite, the new scheme does indeed have the conditionality that is appropriate for this stage of our response. Notably, this scheme will only be available for larger companies who are seeing an actual decline in their revenues as a result of coronavirus, ensuring that our support is targeted where it is most needed. Similarly, there will be restrictions on larger companies in terms of capital distributions to shareholders whilst they are in receipt of money for their workers on this scheme, and indeed, they will not be able to make redundancy notices to those workers who are on this scheme throughout its duration. On training, I would just say to the Honourable Member opposite, we have increased training both for post-16 at the budget and indeed in the recent plan for jobs, providing increased access for school leavers to access level 2 qualifications across the board. And notably, one of the hallmarks of our skills system is our successful apprenticeship programme. And what we announced in July was a significant increase in the incentive payment to businesses for taking on a new apprentice. £2,000 cash incentive to businesses to take on an apprentice and provide that valuable in-work training that we know makes such a difference to young people's futures. So we are committed to providing especially our young people with the opportunities that they need to succeed in the future. The Honourable Lady opposite talked about jobs. Mr. Speaker, in July we outlined a £30 billion plan for jobs. to support, create and protect jobs across every part of our United Kingdom. Chief among the initiatives was the Kickstart scheme, where right now employers, small, medium and large, are rushing to put in applications to take on a young Kickstarter to start later this autumn and provide them with the opportunities that they need at an incredibly difficult time. And I can assure this House and the country my number one economic priority is to protect people's jobs. And that's what this government will continue to do. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the opposition wanted the furlough extended, but they never said for how long. Then they wanted the furlough replaced, but they wouldn't say what with. Then they wanted the furlough targeted, but they wouldn't say to who. I do stand ready to work with the honourable member opposite if she knew exactly what she wanted. Today, the government stands with the British people and British business, with the CBI, with the British Chambers of Commerce, with the Trades Union Congress in bringing much needed support to the economy. Yesterday, the leader of the opposition called for a plan B for the economy. Mr. Speaker, the party opposite don't even have a plan A.
Now heading to the chair of the Select Committee.
That was Rishi Sunak with his latest raft of plans in response to what is going on with the coronavirus. We're joined now by our political correspondent Ellie Price and our business reporter Danny Hewson. Ellie, if I start with you and the politics, was that where we were expecting it? Any changes? Remind us what we heard.
Yeah, I think that is roughly where we were expecting. There are a few other extra little bits that we didn't know about. So yeah, the biggie was obviously the announcement of this, the change to the furlough scheme, basically, which is called the Job Support Scheme, which I think there had been some question over exactly how much the government would pay for in terms of... but it's basically the idea is this, that if a company can keep someone on up to a third of their hours, or rather at least a third of their hours, the government and the employer will then top up the rest of their fees. So the idea is basically it's not the furlough, because it keeps people in jobs that actually do exist. The big concern, I think, amongst Conservatives about the furlough scheme, the big reason why it wasn't extended in its current form is that there were a number of jobs, a number of people on the furlough scheme whose jobs basically just won't exist because of the way the economy has been changed by this virus. So the idea behind this new scheme is that it's people keeping jobs that have some sense of viability and some sense of the future. What he also announced were changes to some of the loans that are available to small businesses, or to all businesses, but particularly small and medium-sized ones, which will certainly help cash flow. There were some concerns that many of those loans would have to be repaid next year. It looks like they've been now extended for 6 to 10 years into the future. So that will be welcomed as well. And a halt on VAT being currently hospitality and tourism industries pay just 5% of VAT. That was looking to go back to 20% very shortly. That won't go back up to 20% until March. So some quite big stuff there. It's interesting, Emma, you and I were talking about this, I think, 24 hours ago? We didn't even know this was going to happen. So the government's obviously moved pretty quickly on this. Of course, there's a sense that this is all because of those tighter restrictions that were announced back on, where are we now? I don't remember what day we're on. We're Thursday now, so the tighter restrictions were announced on Tuesday. There's a sense really that the government needed to do something to kick-start, or rather keep the economy ticking over while those restrictions came into place. But I think also, obviously, there'd been increasing louder voices, not just from the opposition, but from the Conservative MPs as well, that something needed to be done to help jobs and to help the economy.
And how important is it to have the TUC, to have the union, one of the biggest unions, on side?
Really important. I think there was a photo opportunity earlier, wasn't there, where the Chancellor was standing with the Trades Union, Francis O'Grady from the TUC, and Carolyn Fairbairn from the CBI, the big business organisation. I think the sense that this has sort of been well received across the board from, it helps workers and it helps business is huge. And it leaves Labour in a sort of slightly awkward position, exactly kind of how to sort of oppose this. I mean, they're certainly welcoming the changes to the furlough scheme, and would say, look, we've been calling for this for ages. I think Annalise Dodd talked about Labour had called for it 40 times and have been rebuffed 20 times. But in a way, it's sort of it makes it more difficult for Labour to come up with a criticism, because, yeah, this has been welcomed across the board. And of course, Labour would say, look, there's more you can be done. I think Annalise Dodd was talking about incentivising training and gaps that may not be able to help with. But certainly, I think, as I say, this has been broadly well received across the board.
Thank you. Ellie Price, our political correspondent, putting us in the picture. Business reporter Danny Hewson with us. Danny, what's your take?
It's interesting that he didn't do anything at all to address the excluded. I know you were talking about this a lot earlier on. Millions of people have been calling for help, saying that they haven't had anything at all from the Chancellor, despite the fact that he continues to say, you know, we are supporting people and no one will be left behind. There are going to be questions, I think, from some businesses, because they're going to have to be paying 55% of an employee's wages and getting just 33% of the hours that they work. So they are going to have to put quite a bit of money in order to allow this short working scheme to go ahead. Now, a lot of these businesses that have had employers who've been unable to work at all and really facing difficult times with this 10 o'clock curfew, they're going to struggle to be able to find this additional money, even with the continued support, the deferred payment for things like those bounce-back loans, and being given extra time to pay VAT and to pay it over a longer period of time, smaller bits rather than one big chunk in March. This is still going to be a big ask for some employers. And what was also really interesting is the fact that Rishi Sunak very much targeted this support. So it's not going to be open to absolutely everyone. He said that it will be open to all small and medium-sized businesses, but the larger companies will have to demonstrate that their turnover has actually fallen before they are eligible to access this job support scheme. So it'll be interesting to see when all the detail comes out exactly what people think of it. And I think some of the self-employed are going to be really pleased that they did get something. It's going to be a similar scheme to the job support scheme for the self-employed. They did get a grant which came in May, and then they got another one which they got in July. But when you're talking about, you know, potentially 2/3 of somebody's money coming in, it's still going to be a tough time for people.
Danny Hewson, thank you very much, our business reporter there. Well, Rishi Sunak said the job support scheme was built on 3 principles.
The job support scheme is built on 3 principles. First, it will support viable jobs. To make sure of that, employees must work at least 1/3 of their normal hours and be paid for that work as normal by their employer. The government, together with employers, will then increase those people's wages, covering 2/3 of the pay they have lost by reducing their working hours. And the employee will keep their job. Second, we will target support at firms who need it the most. All small and medium-sized businesses are eligible, but larger businesses only when their turnover has fallen through the crisis. Third, it will be open to employers across the United Kingdom, even if they have not previously used the furlough scheme. The scheme will run for 6 months, starting in November. And employers retaining furloughed staff on shorter hours can claim both the job support scheme and the jobs retention bonus.
Carl Emerson is Deputy Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Carl, tell us your take on what you've just heard, but also I suppose there's a bigger question around eligibility here. Tell us, though, your first take.
So I guess the big judgment the Chancellor's making is he's saying that where employers are prepared to make a contribution over and above paying for the hours that the employee is actually working, where they're prepared to make a contribution, the government will also make a contribution so that the pay cut that the employee will get for reducing their hours isn't anywhere near as big as it would be. And the idea behind making employers make the contribution is you're trying to target this government support at the jobs that will be around in the longer term. We're trying to protect those jobs that we think will be viable. And the government saying, well, you know, if the employer's chipping in with some of that contribution, we can be more confident that that's the case. And I've got a lot of sympathy with that. It's very similar to schemes that we've seen in Germany, in Italy, and in Spain when they've had recessions in the past, and those schemes have been shown to be quite effective and can work. Clearly, the issue is going to be it's not going to, for those who get it, it's actually pretty generous, I think, actually. The employee, yes, will have to take a pay cut for working less hours, but the employer and the taxpayer is picking up quite a slice of that reduction in pay. But for those whose employers, of course, aren't prepared to make the additional contribution, perhaps because the job's not viable in the longer term, then this will still be very, very painful. They are likely to lose their jobs when the furlough, if they haven't done already so, when the furlough scheme comes to an end at the end of October.
Will all businesses, I know he said that all small to medium-sized ones are eligible for the Jobs Support Scheme, but bigger companies are only eligible if their turnovers have fallen during the crisis. Surely that will be everyone.
Well, there'll be some businesses who'll actually grown, because even in recessions we know that some businesses succeed and grow, and just in booms we know that some businesses fail. So there will be some businesses who've just had, perhaps they only started up a couple of years ago and they're on a strong growth path, and even if the coronavirus has affected them adversely, it might have just reduced the extent to which they're growing. So there will be some larger firms who are excluded from this scheme, but I guess they're the kind of firms who would perhaps have been looking to take on new members of staff. Perhaps they won't find it very hard to protect their existing employees, and that's why the government's not wanting to target support to them, doesn't feel that this policy is so necessary for them. I think the bigger challenge for the government is going to be this big trade-off between, yes, we want to keep employees kind of locked in jobs where those jobs are long-run viable, and we're prepared to make quite a big contribution towards that extra borrowing the government will be doing to pay for that should be worthwhile. But on the other hand, we don't really want to be locking people into jobs which aren't going to be viable. It's obviously awful if people are losing their jobs now, but it may be just as bad if they lost their jobs in 6 months' time. It may be better to get them on the path of trying to find alternative employment that is going to be viable long term.
Do you think it's generous what he's announced?
Well, I think for those who are going to be benefiting from it, I think it is pretty generous. I mean, to take an example of an employee whose hours they're only working a third of their normal hours, well, they're going to get 77% of their normal gross pay. So that's pretty generous. It's twice as much per hour worked, and that's before things like taxes and benefits, which will mean actually the employee will see an even smaller reduction in their net pay. So I think for those who get the scheme, it looks like it's pretty generous, and it's certainly for many of those individuals going to be much more preferable to unemployment during a period when unfortunately unemployment will be rising and it'll be much harder to get alternative work. There'll be gaps though. There will be people whose employers just aren't viable. There'll be people falling through those cracks, and they're the ones who are going to have perhaps the hardest time over the next 6 months.
And those who've been this hashtag excluded UK, just a word on, did we hear anything for them that or any hints there that you can detect? Well,
one group, of course, won't benefit from an employee scheme is the self-employed, and the Chancellor did say there was going to be a new self-employment scheme. We haven't seen I haven't seen details of that as yet. I presume it won't be as generous as the self-employment schemes that have been in place so far, just because this employee scheme isn't as generous as the employee schemes we've seen so far. But I presume there will be something there for the self-employed. But again, there'll be undoubtedly targeting that group as hard. The newly self-employed, for example, is a group that the government's found it very difficult to support in recent months, and that may well still be a challenge.
Thank you very much for your time and your analysis there. Carl Emerson, Deputy Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Your take, please, on what you just heard from the Chancellor, 85058. Many more details around that wage subsidy scheme. He also said overall, which I think is something for us to ponder together, that there has been and will be now a more permanent adjustment to our economy. What do you make of that? It's 12:32. Let's get the latest news and sport.
On digital, BBC Sounds, smart speaker and online.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
And with the 5 Live News, I'm Liam Smedley. The Chancellor is setting out new measures to protect millions of UK jobs and the economy over the winter as stricter coronavirus rules come into force. The 6-month job support scheme will see the government pay part of workers' wages who've lost hours. Rishi Sunak's under pressure from business, unions and MPs to come up with a suitable replacement for the furlough scheme, which ends next month. Latest figures from the Department of Health indicate that 75% of close contacts of people who tested positive for COVID-19 in England were reached through the test and trace system and asked to self-isolate in the week to September the 16th. That was down from 76% the previous week and more than 77% in mid-August. Meanwhile, after months of delays, smartphone users in England and Wales can now download the NHS contact tracing app. It's designed to alert users that they may have been close to someone infected with COVID-19. One of the places where it was trialled was Newham in East London. And tributes are being paid to the British journalist Sir Harold Evans, who's died in New York at the age of 92. He was the former editor of the Sunday Times and championed investigative reporting. Let's get the sport now with Katie Shannon.
And some breaking news to bring you, as it's been confirmed that the former Australian cricketer Dean Jones has died at the age of 59. Reports say that he suffered a cardiac arrest in Mumbai, where he was working as a commentator on the Indian Premier League. The legendary batsman played 52 tests and 164 one-day internationals for Australia. He also played for Durham and Derbyshire in county cricket in England. So that's sad news that the former Australian batsman turned commentator Dean Jones has died at the age of 59. Well, staying with cricket, as we can check in on day 2 of the Bob Willis Trophy final between Somerset and Essex, and I'll pass you over to Dan Norcross, who can bring us up to date.
2:29 for 5 Somerset. They've had a very, very good morning, losing just the 1 wicket. Stephen Davis was the man to go for 27. Since then, a partnership of 90 between Craig Overton, who has 48, and Ed Byram. His first score above 30 this season. He's moved to 96. They're going very well. The sun is shining. The pitch has suddenly got a lot easier to bat. We're coming up to lunch. There's probably going to be about 1.5 overs to go, and Essex desperately searching for a wicket. 2:30 for 5 now. Overton 49. Ed Byram 96.
Dan, thank you very much. And commentary continues over on Sports Extra. You can also watch the final live on the BBC Sport website and the app. Right, a boost for Chelsea fans today, as the club have announced the signing of goalkeeper Edouard Mendy from Rennes on a 5-year deal. Frank Lampard wants to increase competition with Kepa. Well, Mendy is Chelsea's 8th signing this summer. Burnley, we're hearing, are interested in signing the Wales international Harry Wilson from Liverpool and have made contact with the club. The 23-year-old winger spent last season on loan at Bournemouth and made 35 appearances, scoring 7 goals. Well, Liverpool don't want to loan Wilson out again, so any move would have to be permanent. Now, the former Tottenham manager Harry Redknapp believes that Premier League clubs will look after themselves first when they struggle to cope with the financial pressure of the coronavirus crisis. Some reports suggest that clubs from the top division could agree to a support package worth in the region of £250 million. And Redknapp agrees that gesture would help, but says he can't see it happening.
No, it wouldn't take a lot, but you know what happens. The big boys look after themselves. Are they really interested in what's happening down below or any other football club? I don't know if they are. And I just think that's the way it is. You know, they're not prepared to, to give a bit to lower clubs to keep them afloat. I don't see it.
The National League is holding a board meeting this afternoon to decide on whether to start their season on the 3rd of October. Following the postponement of the government's plans to allow spectators to return to stadiums, some teams in the top 2 tiers of non-league football in England feel they cannot afford to play behind closed doors. Others, though, think they must get started whilst generate some income via live streaming. Here's John Crute, who's the chief executive of Chesterfield.
We're under pressure. It's devastating for the National League. We can't cancel the season. We've got to play football. We need government support. We need help. There's more to a football club than just turning up on a Saturday afternoon. It's part of the fabric of this town. This club's almost 155 years old.
And in tennis, Britain's Harriet Dart has been knocked out in the second round of qualifying for the French Open. She was beaten by Irina Bara from Romania in straight sets. And that's the latest from BBC Sport.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live, available on the BBC Sounds app. The Emma Barnett Show.
You know what you think of what you just heard from the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak? If you weren't with us or you didn't catch all of it, he's announced a new job support scheme which starts in November. It replaces the furlough scheme which ends at the end of October and means the government will pay part of workers' wages who've had their hours reduced. Among other measures, he also announced the cut in VAT to 5% for the hospitality and tourism sector will be extended until the 31st of March, and firms that took government loans during the crisis will have longer to pay them back. Claire Brooke is an employment lawyer. for Aaron. Claire, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Hi. Thank you for inviting me today.
You've also kindly offered to take a few questions from our listeners if they've got them, but also some comments. I'm sure we will not be in short supply of them. What is your reaction, first of all, to the Chancellor's statement?
Well, I think it's a positive step for the Chancellor to outline the additional support scheme that's going to be available from the beginning of November. What we do have is clarity that this is going to be a scheme that's available for 6 months. It will be in addition to the bonus that was announced earlier this year, and it will be available following the closure of the furlough scheme at the end of October. So there is some clarity, and of course we will have lots of questions out of the announcement, and until we have some formal guidance in place or draft regulations, we won't know the full detail of the scheme. But it does provide all SME employers with eligibility to put their employees into this scheme, assuming they're able to work at least 33% of their normal hours of work. So
that's the big assumption. Let me just break in at that point, not to be rude, but because the Prime Minister has just been speaking to journalists in Northamptonshire, giving his reaction to the Chancellor's statement. We presumably knew it was coming, but here's what Boris Johnson had to say.
We're continuing to do everything we can to support the workforce, support jobs, livelihoods throughout the crisis, and again some very creative and imaginative proposals from the Chancellor. But here, the really important thing is that everybody follows the guidance that we've set out, and that's why I'm here today in Northamptonshire talking to the police about what they're doing to underpin, to support the enforcement of those rules. And it's absolutely vital that everybody does it. I know that people sort of think, well, it's a great package of new rules to depress the virus, but will it be enforced? And my message is, yes, it will be, and there will be serious fines for people who don't comply.
But how does the promise... Your Chancellor is announcing that he is pulling life support from a large number of jobs which aren't viable because of coronavirus. You're on course for large numbers of job losses. What do you say to the people who are about to lose their jobs? Where are they going to get new ones?
Well, the Chancellor is being totally realistic with people about the prospects of the economy. Things will be tough. What we're saying to people who do the right thing, as you put it, Sam, who self-isolate, when they are contacted by NHS Test and Trace, they will get support. As you know, there's £500 to support them, but there's also a £10,000 fine potentially if you don't comply, and it's absolutely vital that we all work together now to get the R down, get the virus back under control, and then and simultaneously allow education and the economy to continue. That is the best thing for jobs, for growth in this country.
That's the Prime Minister there talking after the Chancellor about what we've just heard from Rishi Sunak with regards to what's happening after the furlough has ended. We were just talking there to Claire Brook, an employment lawyer. You were just making the comment about who was going to be eligible here and how that was going to work. Sorry to have interrupted you.
Not at all. That's absolutely fine. So we were just recapping over the fact that all SME employers will be eligible, assuming their employees are working at least 1/3 of their usual hours by November when this scheme becomes available. Larger employers will also be available, but only if they're able to show that their turnover has dropped as a result of the COVID pandemic. Again, we'll have to wait for the guidance to understand any specific rules around that. And importantly, employers don't have to have taken advantage of the furlough scheme that's currently in place in order to be eligible for the new job support scheme. So those are some kind of eligibility factors for employers to consider. In terms of employees who might be eligible for this payment, they will have to be in work at least 1/3 of the time by the introduction of, assuming it has to be by November, but let's wait for that guidance to clarify that point. And it has to be viable jobs. Now again, whether that's just the government confirming that it's with the intention that these jobs will be available. Of course, no employer can guarantee that a job will be available for life, will they? So I suppose we'll wait to see what, if at all, there is some form of clarity over what is meant by a viable job.
I suppose that it's also a question, if you're an employee, are you now going to be asked when coming off the furlough to work a set amount of time, or how will that work in terms of hours and pay?
So it will be variable for everybody, won't it? I mean, different employees have different types of contracts. So let's take your employee who has fixed hours. They would need to be in work for at least a third of those usual fixed hours that they're employed to carry out in their contract of employment. However, we'll have to wait and see what the government have to say about 0 hours workers, where perhaps they don't necessarily have a fixed pattern of work and perhaps do variable hours. It may well be that there is some form of guidance around calculating average hours over a relevant period of time. That's the kind of thing I might expect from the guidance, and we would hope that it would provide further clarity very soon.
It's a strange one, this, Claire, in terms of your rights versus what is the reality, isn't it? Because you may not wish to reduce your hours, you may not wish to work the new hours you are given, but if that's a way of keeping your job, of course, you'll do it. But I wonder, how does that marry up with rights?
So employees' rights are enshrined in a number of different employment laws that are in place, and they are not changed, again, subject to any specific guidance to the contrary. But an employee will have their rights enshrined in their contract of employment, and that will set out their employment rights in terms of minimum hours, or if they're on 0 hours, what pattern is in arrangement. Now, if an employer wishes to change that, then they'll need to get either voluntary consent, an agreement from an employee, and my best advice in that situation would be to have a sensible conversation and consult appropriately around the proposals with a view to reaching agreement between both parties. And if voluntary agreement can be achieved, then obviously a variation of contract can be drawn up and properly put in writing. If employees aren't willing to agree to an employer's proposal to either bring someone back on furlough on 33% of their hours with the potential 77% pay arrangement that would be in place, as we're seeing from this announcement today, then an employer could commence a formal consultation process with a view to trying to enforce changes to terms and conditions. But ultimately, if an employer is in a position where they're having to save cost, then of course, if agreement isn't reached, ultimately that could potentially result in redundancies, couldn't it?
It could indeed. We've got questions coming in. I will come to those in just a moment and be speaking to people with specific issues to put to you, so stay with us for that. But let me just cross now to Martin Greehouse, in Leeds, who's director of Mojo Cocktail Bars. They've got 5 sites across the north of England, 84 staff, and before March this year, some of their sites would stay open as late as 5 a.m. You've been listening to Rishi Sunak's announcement. Hi, Martin. What's your reaction?
Hi, Emma. In fairness, at least hearing that there is some support becoming available and an extension to, or a change to the furlough scheme is very welcome. That was, as always, how we were going to look after our team was of our primary concern. That and the extension in the other areas with regarding funding are all pretty welcome. I mean, I do believe there is still one fairly looming elephant in the room for a lot of hospitality, which is how ultimately we're going to deal with building rent demands, which for a lot of people in our industry are now 6 months worth of pent-up rent that there's no plan to deal with.
So that's a big question for you. I mean, I feel like there's going to be a few of those, aren't there, where you're still not getting any answers. But also, you've still got to try and operate, haven't you, in your line of work under some very strange social restrictions.
Yeah, it's almost like going back to the 1970s with very early closing hours. For a business such as ourselves, and I think it's worth stressing it because there's been a lot of talk saying that, it's an hour off your trading. Well, even for a local country club, it's not an hour, it's an hour and a half, because we have to be calling time at 9:30, not at 10. We need to have the building clear and locked down by 10. But for people such as ourselves, and there are a lot of city centre bar operators and restaurant operators who are losing a full sitting, where we're going to look. We are currently estimating we'll lose somewhere between 50 and 70% of our turnover. It's very difficult to manage. Now, those projections are based on a hope that people's behavioural patterns, I should say our hope, not the government, that people's behavioural patterns will shift slightly and they will come out and still socialise earlier. But there's no guarantee of that.
It's very, very difficult indeed. And those figures that you're talking about and the amount you're down is just can't really kind of process it. Thank you for talking to us. Go on, Martin. Final thought.
Sorry. I was just going to say, because obviously my section of hospitality is the bar industry, but I have friends in the restaurant trade, and that for them this is a 30% slice out of their business hours, effective business hours, I should say, when they've already been reduced to less than half their physical capacity. And protecting jobs is fine, but if the business doesn't exist at the end of it, what is the point of spending the money?
There you go. It's a very important question as well in all of this. Martin Greenhow, thank you very much for your time. We're just going to go back to Claire Brook, an employment lawyer who's with us, taking a few questions. Claire, let me put a couple to you before we get people on air who are on the line, which have come in on text. Message here, quick question. If you take a drop in hours, what effect does it have on your pension? Claire.
Okay, so again, that's something that can be agreed between the employer and the employee. However, if the employer proposes to prorata all benefits, including pension, in line with a reduction in basic pay, then that is potentially possible, isn't it? So we're waiting for the updated guidance in relation to the new job support scheme. It may well be that provides some further clarity in terms of auto-enrolment for those employees who have the it may well impact on pension contributions. So certainly something for employers to be clear and transparent about in terms of the effect of placing somebody into a reduced hours environment, whether that's through the support scheme or in some form of more permanent change arrangement.
Okay, thank you for that. Another one here from Michael who says, what happens to people who may be new employees? I'm moving to London, away from Newcastle due to having to leave my current flat. What happens to people like me may have to move and seek new employment?
Okay, so with the furlough scheme, employees had to be on the payroll within a specific time frame in order to be eligible. We haven't had that level of clarity today from Rishi's announcement in respect of whether or not there's going to need to have been some form of minimum period of employment in order to be eligible for the job support scheme. So actually, that's a very interesting question, and I will make a note of that, and we will, as a firm, make sure that as soon as we have that information, we'll publish that in order that we can help individuals and employers who are perhaps asking these questions that we don't yet have the detail for. Obviously, if it's the case that there is no minimum specific service requirement for this particular individual caller's question, then it may be that if that person obtains new employment, they may be able to take advantage of the scheme.
Thank you for that. Let's speak to Paul, who's on the line. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Emma.
Paul in Harrogate. What do you want to ask, and tell us the situation you're in?
Well, my concern, I'm actually quite a supporter of Rishi Sunak, and I think he's had an enormously difficult job, and I think the package he's announced today for the people that it's relevant to, I think is quite creative. My concern is the fact that I own 8 nightclubs across the UK, and since the 23rd of March, we aren't allowed by law to even open. Now, none of the support that he offers today gives me 1 penny of any benefit. We have had 220, 230 staff employed in management. We let 110 go 10 days ago, and we're in a position now where none of our remaining staff or management can be paid because, other than applying their notice, the notice that they have under their contract, purely because we're not even allowed to open to trade to generate any income. So it just appears that we are, and it's not just myself, I mean, there are over 1,000 nightclubs in the UK who are in the same boat, and we seem to have been completely lost in the discussion because we don't even have the right to trade to try and offset any of the costs that we have, and it just appears that we're being hung on the gallows as and we are viable businesses. We're not businesses that were asking for anything before lockdown, and we've had, because most of our businesses are over the £51,000 rich threshold, then we've been unable to claim for most of the businesses any support whatsoever so far. So it just appears to be, despite our appeals for some support, it appears to be quite a one-sided package aimed at pubs and restaurants. And was, I think, a number of the pubs and restaurants who are primarily the food-led pubs and restaurants have done their level best to comply with the regulations as they existed until yesterday. You have a number of pubs, predominantly estate pubs and sport-led pubs, who haven't complied, have made no attempt to do it in social distancing, but there's been zero enforcement from local authorities. And any spike in cases over the last 4 weeks can have nothing at all to do with the late night industry because we haven't been open. So it just seems quite counterintuitive that the solution that Boris Johnson is applying in terms of the 10 p.m. curfew doesn't seem to target the actual problem, because the rise in infections has been primarily schools, primarily hospitals, with a small part of hospitality.
Is there anything you can say to that? I mean, I understand the situation that's just been laid out. This is extremely difficult. Claire, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, Paul, I hear you. I suppose the only thing we can say in terms of the job support scheme is that, of course, there will be businesses that aren't able to take advantage of winners and losers within this programme. Clearly, if there are roles within the business that you can have working up to 33% of what would have ordinarily been normal hours, that might be something you can then take advantage of. However, where you're still required to be closed, I appreciate that will limit the number of positions, if any, that you are able to bring back. Now, remember, this scheme is here for the next 6 months, and it would be great news if, for whatever reason, we're able to see an easing on restrictions in order for other sectors, and particularly dances, nightclubs, in order for them to be able to open to take advantage of the scheme. But as things currently stand with the current rate of infection, of course, we haven't had any such indication at the moment, have we? But Paul, of course, if you want to have a separate chat about the options available to you, we would be very pleased to do so. In terms of your remaining staff, there are a number of other ways in which you can look to retain them, whether that's through some form of kind of unpaid leave, if that's agreed once the furlough scheme ends. If there isn't, potentially some form of other targeted support that may yet be announced. Again, we don't have the information yet, but if that becomes available, and I understand there are a number of organisations who are looking to promote sector targeted support, and of course leisure and entertainment sectors are clamouring for that extra support, aren't they, at the moment?
All right. Is there anything you want to say to that, Paul?
Well, it's obviously a welcome piece of general advice, but I think we've been as creative as we can, even up to now, to try and keep people employed, even up to speed. The reduction in the furlough scheme was difficult anyway, purely because we've had not one penny of income allowed to be taken by law for the last 6 months. And cash reserves across this whole sector will dry up in the next fortnight. So unless there is some substantive support offered, and in fairness, all of our creditors, all of our landlords have been very supportive, very pragmatic, but unless some substantive scheme is put in place, and I absolutely agree that there should be a targeted level of support, because there were a lot of people on the furlough scheme that otherwise would have gone home for the summer and not needed a job at all. And again, you can look at the number of restaurants who are allowed by law now to open that are staying shut because they're better off on the furlough scheme. We actually just want the right to trade, or we want some support to force us to stay shut, because we're not talking about compensating us for loss of profit. We're actually talking about survival, and we literally have several weeks to make some pretty critical decisions on whether this sector will actually survive.
Yeah, it's a very important point, Paul, on a series of points there. Let me just bring in Chris in Brighton. Paul, all the best. Thanks for getting in touch with us. Chris, in a nutshell, where are you up to? Chris in Brighton, hello.
Yeah, hi, sorry, yeah, got you.
Go on, what's your situation and what's your reaction?
The situation is, I'm an actor, and the whole of the theatre industry is essentially completely closed down at the moment. We have no work. For those of us who work mostly in theatre, it's appalling, because you can't even get a part-time job in theatre at the moment. And this is an activity to operate crumb the ball for people working in the creative industry. If you can't work at all, and the adjustments to the self-employed income that you mentioned matched up with the job support. You're working on percentages there of the number of part-time hours worked, and we cannot even work any part-time hours. So it seems as though there's nothing being offered for theatre, for live music, performers, and we're a bit lost there.
Anything you want to say? I mean, at this point, I know it's very difficult. Claire Brook. No, I'm going to bring in Claire Brook, an employment lawyer there. But is there anything just in this bigger area of where you just simply cannot work, Claire?
Chris, yes, I've listened carefully to what you said, and again, I suppose my comments before about targeted support and the fact that we're waiting to hear whether there might be anything further on that. Again, we don't know. But if, for example, you are, or any of your colleagues within the theatre or creative industries work self-employed freelancers, of course, what Rishi did say today as part of his announcement that there will be an extension of the self-employed scheme. So if you have been able to take advantage of that, it may well be that is something subject to the detail, and of course we're waiting for that guidance to come out. So hopefully that will provide some clarity on what you might be able to be eligible for there.
All right, thank you very much. I really appreciate everyone getting in touch, and Claire Brook, your time as well as an employment lawyer, trying to grapple with this as it develops, which is kind of how it is at the moment. Thank you to all of you with your messages throughout the programme. Keep it here with us on 5 Live. Chris Warburton's up next.
Yes.
Hi, Chris.
Hello, Emma. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, stay with us on 5 Live. We'll continue to talk about this, of course, throughout the next 3 hours and beyond on 5 Live. If you want to give me a call, we've got an employment lawyer joining us as well. We'll speak to the CBI. Love to hear your stories, whatever situation you find yourself in, on the usual numbers.
On digital, BBC Sounds, smart speaker and online.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
BBC News at 1 o'clock. This is Mike Powell. The Chancellor has set out plans to protect what he called viable jobs with wage support and business loans. The number of people getting COVID test results back within 24 hours has fallen, and Wrexham Football Club confirms it's in takeover talks with one of the biggest names in Hollywood. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, has outlined what he called radical interventions in the labour market to try to help businesses through the next 6 months. Coronavirus restrictions are being tightened across the UK, and the current furlough scheme finishes at the end of October. In the past hour, he announced his new job support scheme in the Commons to maintain what he called viable jobs.
Employees must work at least a third of their normal hours and be paid for that work as normal by their employer. The government, together with employers, will then increase those people's wages, covering 2/3 of the pay they have lost by reducing their working hours. And the employee will keep their job.
Well, Mr. Sunak also said the government recognised that cash flow was a problem and that he would extend the period for more than 1 million small businesses to repay their bounce-back loans under a pay-as-you-grow scheme.
This means loans can now be extended from 6 to 10 years, nearly halving the average monthly repayment. Businesses who are struggling can now choose to make interest-only payments, and anyone in real trouble can apply to suspend repayments altogether for up to 6 months.
The Chancellor also said he was cancelling a planned VAT rise, keeping it at 5% for the hospitality and tourism industries until the 31st of March. Labour broadly welcomed the Chancellor's statement but questioned why it had taken so long. The TUC said that Mr. Sunak had done the right thing, and the package was also welcomed by the business group the CBI. Paul Johnson is the director of the independent think tank, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. He says many currently furloughed workers will lose their jobs.
It is a big step back from the furlough scheme, and it's not going to stop a rise in unemployment over the next few months. I'm not saying it's the wrong choice. I think the Chancellor is right that you cannot support these jobs forever, but it's also important to be clear that it is a big step down in generosity.
There's been a drop in the number of people being tested in the community for COVID-19 in England who received their results within 24 hours. The latest figures show that nearly 3 times as many people are now being diagnosed with the disease compared with the end of last month. Our science correspondent Palab Ghosh has the details.
These figures, which cover all testing, confirm the recent upsurge in cases. They show a 3% increase of those testing positive on the previous week. But since the end of August, the upturn is 180%. The sheer volume of infections has meant that turnaround times for the tests continue to take longer. Just over 10% were received within 24 hours of a swab being taken, compared with just over 14% in the previous week. And since mid-August, the distance to testing sites has been increasing, with an average of just over 5 miles.
The Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, has confirmed it will be a legal requirement for people to self-isolate if they're advised to do so by the new NHS contact tracing app. It launched in England and Wales this morning. However, he urged anyone who receives such a message to do so as they are asked. People over the age of 16 are being encouraged to download the app to their smartphone. Wrexham Football Club has confirmed it's in takeover talks with the Hollywood actors Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney. Members of the fan-owned National League club have voted overwhelmingly for negotiations to proceed. It could see a £2 million investment from the stars. Spencer Harris is one of Wrexham's directors.
They will set out their vision of why and what they intend to do in due course. But from our perspective, the question would be, well, why not? Wrexham is the 3rd oldest professional club in the world. It's the oldest professional club in Wales, and it plays at the oldest international stadium anywhere in the world, the Racecourse Ground.
In the city a short time ago, the 100-share index was down 7 points at 5,892. The weather, a windy afternoon across southwest England with a mix of sunny spells and blustery showers for most of us. Drier over northern Scotland. A cooler day, temperatures reaching 16 in London, 13 in Cardiff and 11 in Edinburgh and Belfast. And that's the BBC News at 1:05.
BBC Sounds.
Cast your mind back to the so-called second summer of love. A quiet and not so quiet revolution was going on. Motorways, synthesizers, gatherings, 303s and pills. Ecstasy, the battle of...
К нему было очень большое количество претензий по качеству, потому что тут же началась проблема по распредвалам. Тот плохой мужик нехозяйственный, у кого в гараже не лежит 2 запасных распредвала к «Жигулям». Начали менять технологию. У итальянцев купили одно, потом немножечко модернизировали. Получилось так, что вся страна опять встала в позу речного жителя, он же июньский знак зодиака. Ну, то же самое было с датчиком холла, когда переходили на передний привод на 8-ку, у которой тоже имени так и не было. Она осталась 8-кой, она осталась зубилом, но она никогда не была Самарой. Она, тем более, никогда не была спутником. И, конечно, вершина того, что сделал АвтоВАЗ, это Нива. Когда в 1977 году вот этот потенциал людей и конкретно прусов создали машину, не имеющую аналогов, и стали родоначальником класса кроссоверов, самого популярного на сегодняшний день на планете Земля, это говорит о том, что потенциал завода был очень высок, инженерная команда была на потрясающем уровне. Притом, задел по технологиям еще оставался. Нива, конечно, требовала других агрегатов, но даже из того, что мы купили у итальянцев, а это 1977 год, а мы купили изделие 1966 года, позволяло, тем не менее, еще конкурировать, еще создавать, еще творить, еще выдумывать и идти на опережение. На опережение, представляете, мы сделали машину, которая ушла туда, где не было никого, где никаких конкурентов. Нива наша. Нива — автомобиль потрясающий. И как только у нас состоялся Волжский автозавод, как состоялся вот этот пробный пуск из 6 машин первой якобы партии, которые на самом деле всего-навсего подарок Ленину 6 машин, но никак не пуск завода, началось движение, пошел автоспорт, страна получила новый двигатель, вся остальная автомобильная промышленность получила новые аккумуляторы, новые дворники, новые стекла, новые электрику. Началось тут же растаскивание по углам, потому что те заводы, которые изначально работали на АвтоВАЗ, они тут же стали получать заказы ото всех. Подрулевые рычажки, кнопочки с подсветкой. У нас в СССР не было ни одной кнопки с подсветкой. У нас ничего не подсвечивалось, тем более у нас кнопок не было. У нас на автомобилях были либо дергалки, либо поворотные штуковины, которые нужно было либо направо, либо налево как-то крутить, вертеть, либо на себя, ну как на Волге, там подсос, фары на 24-й Волге. 24-я Волга, между прочим, ровесник 70-го года. Но архаика же абсолютная. 24-я Волга, это же просто средневековье какое-то. Это же вырубленное без единого гвоздя, из одного бревна нечто недопустимое абсолютно. Его нужно было 24-ю Волгу не пускать в производство, а сразу отправлять, ну, мягко говоря, на рестайлинг. А «Жигули» — это была машина песни, машина мечта. Потом, кстати, добавились другие цвета, стали другие комплектации, модификации, нарастание модельного ряда. ВАЗ-2111, ВАЗ-2113. То же самое с двушками, у которых новые двигатели стали появляться. ВАЗ-2103, ВАЗ-2106. Замечательно. И тут же автоспорт начался. И все, кто занимался тем, чтобы мастерил гоночную машину, что-то мастерил, в принципе, они получили новый двигатель. Новый двигатель, это не чита Уфимскому. Наша страна вся в дальнейшем ездила в любых своих изделиях и любых своих поделках на ВАЗовских двигателях. До переднего привода еще было далеко. Вот этот тот самый Андроновский, который Андронов выбил из итальянцев, он вдохнул жизнь во все то, что у нас двигалось на каком бы то ни было моторе, не предусмотренном заводом. И спортсмены в первую очередь это оценили. И АвтоВАЗ, он выбил АЗЛК практически отовсюду, со всех позиций лидирующих. Вот в 70-м году еще был Лондон-Мехико. Кстати, 19 апреля стартовал Лондон-Мехико, знаменитейший марафон. Тогда «Жигулей» никаких не было. Там была команда заводская, МЗМА на 412-х. А потом потихонечку завод «Москвич» сошел, хотя Сан Шпикуленко рубился с «Жигулями» до последнего, но у «АвтоВАЗа» была другая техника, у «АвтоВАЗа» были другие двигатели, и у «АвтоВАЗа» потом нашелся через Прибалтику партнер в Финляндии, который, конечно, клал на обе лопатки на внутренних чемпионатах всех. Сколько стоили «Жигули»? По этому поводу спорят постоянно 5500. Завод «Москвич» в тот момент самую дорогую машину, которую делал, 412 экспортным в 70-м году, он ее продавал за 5093, то есть 5093 рубля, а тут пришла машина, про которую говорят, что она стоила 5150 она стоила несколько мгновений, потом она стоила 5500. Через какое-то время она подорожала до 7000. ВАЗ-2101. И тем не менее, это была самая любимая машина нашей страны. Восьмерка и девятка не были настолько любимой, хотя, конечно, да, передний привод, и это было уже увядание завода, потому что они пошли по технологиям, когда мы привыкли благодаря «Жигулям», благодаря ВАЗ-2101, например, к мягкой передней панели, а АвтоВАЗ ее больше не воспроизводил. У них нету машин с такой мягкой панелью. То есть «Жигуль» влюбил в себя в страну, и Косыгину огромное спасибо, а завод с юбилеем АвтоВАЗу 50 лет. Все, до свидания.
«Гараж». Программа Сергея Слоняна. С понедельника по четверг. С 14 до 15. На радио «Эхо Москвы». «Гараж».
We can. To do that, I'm announcing today the new Jobs Support Scheme. The government will directly support the wages of people in work, giving businesses who face depressed demand the option of keeping employees in a job on shorter hours rather than making them redundant. The Job Support Scheme is built on three principles. First, it will support viable jobs. To make sure of that, employees must work at least a third of their normal hours and be paid for that work as normal by their employer. The government, together with employers, will then increase those people's wages, covering 2/3 of the pay they have lost by reducing their working hours. And the employee will keep their job. Second, we will target support at firms who need it the most. All small and medium-sized businesses are eligible, but larger businesses only when their turnover has fallen through the crisis. Third, it will be open to employers across the United Kingdom, even if they have not previously used the furlough scheme. The scheme will run for 6 months, starting in November. And employers retaining furloughed staff on shorter hours can claim both the Job Support Scheme and the Jobs Retention Bonus. Mr. Speaker, throughout this crisis we have sought parity between employees and the self-employed, providing more than £13 billion of support to over 2.6 million self-employed small businesses. So I am extending the existing self-employed grant on similar terms and conditions as the new Jobs Support Scheme. Mr. Speaker, these are radical interventions in the UK labour market, policies we have never tried in this country before. Together with the Jobs Retention Bonus, the Kickstart scheme for young people, tens of billions of pounds of job creation schemes, new investment in training and apprenticeships, we are protecting millions of jobs and businesses.
Well, he will be giving a press conference after 3 o'clock, and we'll bring some of that live because he'll no doubt be ask some questions in that press conference. So if you're with us after 3 o'clock, we'll bring some of that to you live. Labour's Shadow Chancellor, Annalise Dodds, responded to the statement with her own questions.
Can the Chancellor be clear? Will this scheme of wage supports actually keep more people in work? Because for that to happen, the scheme must make it more attractive for employers to retain more staff on reduced hours than to retain some full-time and make others redundant. So does his scheme actually incentivise short hours working? What conditions, if any, will be applied to ensure value for public money? Will the scheme require commitments for continuing employment, unlike the existing furlough scheme where there have been abuses? And will it require those participating to provide decent, sustainable work? Will the scheme incentivise training and retraining? The German scheme does, and Labour's called for a UK version to include incentives for training, but that's missing here. Indeed, while, as I said, we welcome many of the elements the Chancellor has announced today, the lack of action on training and skills is worrying. I was waiting and waiting for the Chancellor to talk about training. He mentioned the word once in passing. That's not enough. His government has already allocated funding for a national skills strategy, but it's not being delivered on the ground. So when will the Chancellor get serious about training so people can be ready for the jobs of the future? He mentioned the fact our economy is changing. Let's make sure that our population is ready for that change. Now, Labour's called repeatedly for continued targeted support for the self-employed, so I'm pleased that's referred to here. But will these measures avoid the gaps in coverage that have bedevilled existing schemes? And why is there no forward plan here for the needs of those who are extremely clinically vulnerable to this disease?
So I'd love to hear your reaction to the Chancellor's statement. Are you breathing a slight sigh of relief, more than you thought you might be this afternoon? Will it make that difference to you? Or are you worried that it just won't work for you and your business? Or have you looked at this, have you seen what the Chancellor is saying this afternoon and thought, nah, doesn't seem like there's anything in it for me? I'd love to speak to you. How concerned are you? How relieved might you be? You can call us on 08085 909 693. Do pick up the phone and let's have a chat. Calls are free from mobiles and landlines. You can text 85058. Text a charge at your standard message rate. Or you can get in touch on social media. It's via @BBC5 Live. Or you can email nihal@bbc.co.uk. Our political correspondent is Ellie Price. Ellie, hello.
Hiya.
Hi. So if you were, look, let's just get down to the brass tacks here. If you were given a PowerPoint on what he came up with, the bullet points, what would you have up on the screen?
Well, let's start, shall we, with the job support scheme, as you heard him talking about there, which is the sort of the predecessor, the successor of the furlough scheme. So we knew that the furlough scheme was going to come to an end at the end of next month, and obviously there had been calls to extend it or find a way to sort of do something similar to try and keep some of those jobs in some of those companies where people just can't get back to work properly. They might be able to get back a bit, but you know, they're going to go into the wall if the furlough scheme completely ends. So what the government has come up with is this idea that if an employee can work for at least a third of their hours, the government will then pay a third, and the employer must pay a third of the existing hours they would have had but aren't working because there isn't the work there for whatever reason. So it gets a bit complicated, but basically it means the government's paying far less towards the contribution of that job. And the idea behind it from the government is that these are jobs
that are needed, rather than the furlough scheme, which is arguably in some areas keeping jobs on that aren't going to exist anyway in the future. I mean, this is the balance that the government's trying to tread between keeping people in jobs and keeping people in work, but keeping people in jobs that are viable for the future, and if they're not, then they need to get on and try and find a new job. So that's, I think, the thinking behind that one. It's the sort of the proportions and the percentages of who's playing what is all a bit complicated, and basically I think the important thing to note, and all these sums are coming up now, is basically if you're on a furlough scheme now where the government, where you're paid 80% of your salary and the government is paying that for you. Now, if you're lucky enough to keep a job where you can do a third of your hours, you're actually going to be slightly worse off than you would be had you been on the furlough scheme by a sort of couple of percentages. But I suspect most people would be grateful just to keep a job, because, of course, there'll be plenty of people in jobs that this new scheme won't cover.
Yes, well, that's what I was going to say, actually. Who will be looking at this and thinking, this does nothing for me and I'm slipping through the gaps, basically?
Well, I think a lot was made of the hospitality and the tourism industry, because the other thing that was announced were a bunch of loans that have been going on, and a number of those loans have been extended so that they don't have to be paid back quite so quickly, and they've also been extended so that you can even apply for them. I think that was meant to run out at the end of next month as well. Hospitality and tourism, for example, also will have a bit of rate relief on its VAT. That was meant to end at the end of the month. At the moment, hospitality and tourism pay 5%. That was going to go up to 20%. Now that's been postponed again till the end of March. So there is stuff, but I think there's probably certain industries that will be thinking, well, look, we can't, we can't manage to keep all our jobs on, even if they are at a third. So I guess the likes of aviation, probably some in hospitality, and a number of those, and I think the details from that will be coming out as the day goes on. I think what was interesting in the statement today was this sort of shift in tone. You heard the Chancellor in the clip we heard just then say, I cannot save every business, I cannot save every job. We heard that before, but he was talking about how we all need to find a way of living with this virus, and for the budget, for the economy itself to adapt to what is basically the new normal. This idea that, these restrictions that were announced on Tuesday, and of course there's a number of places around the UK that are already in sort of even stricter restrictions or local lockdowns. This is the new normal now. This is going to go on for at least the next 6 months, probably longer. So we need to find a way of the economy sort of permanently adjusting to what's happened, and that does mean that a number of companies, a number of areas will sort of fall by the wayside.
As well, but I wonder, would there have been any pressure within Cabinet or elsewhere about looking at this from the other side in terms of benefits and such like for people who have lost or who are in danger of losing their jobs, Ellie? Increasing universal credit payments, for example. That's the other side of this, isn't it? Make that safety net that bit tighter for people who are going to find themselves out of work.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, I think the calculation on the government's part is that the government can either support them in work or is going to have to support them on benefits anyway. So whether we see any change to universal credit, haven't heard any rumours of that just yet, but certainly that's the calculation in trying to balance this, because some way or other people are going to need support, aren't they? As this all starts to happen over the next few weeks. And I think, the Chancellor tried to strike this tone of being, positive with the things he's announced, but I think probably conceding that there are going to be plenty of companies that fall by the wayside. And of course, that's what Labour and other opposition parties were saying, that, this doesn't cover everyone. And we've seen even in the existing programmes that were announced, the likes of people in freelancers in performing arts and the media, for example, we've heard a fair bit about them, that, there are certain people that have just fallen through the cracks. And the sort of government feeling is that they can't get to everyone. Have to make these rules as sort of simplistic as possible, but also, in the end, they're all going to need to be paid for in some way. And it's interesting that the budget's been cancelled. There was meant to be a budget by the end of this year. That's been cancelled on the basis that no real long-term or even medium-term plan can be made for the economy yet, because we just don't know where we are. So I think, that says a lot. Despite the Chancellor saying that we've got to learn to live with this now, I think everything is so up in the air at the moment, they can't even commit to doing a budget.
OK, Ellie, thank you. Thanks very much indeed. That's our political correspondent, Ellie Price. Mark's been in touch saying the exhibition sector has been forced to close since March. Companies have made no money, so how can they get people back in? The Chancellor more or less just closed the exhibition industry down today, an industry worth £30 billion, he says. I had a big conversation last night when I was in for Colin about the events sector for a half hour, and people very, very concerned in that area. I wonder how they're feeling after what they heard from the Chancellor in the Commons. Let's have a word with Matthew Fell, who's the CBI's Chief UK Policy Director. Hello, Matthew.
Hello there.
Hi. What's the CBI's reaction to this?
Well, really positive, actually. We think this is a sort of bold and welcome move from the Chancellor today. I think firms right across the country were really hearing the clock ticking loudly on the end of the furlough scheme, and especially in light of the sort of tightened restrictions we heard from the Prime Minister earlier this week. We knew we needed a new intervention. We've been calling for this short-time working scheme, working collaboratively with the government. So a really significant intervention that we think will save hundreds of thousands of jobs through the winter.
Do you? OK. I mean, it will, of course, help those businesses with reduced revenues, won't it? Of course. But what about those whose revenues have totally collapsed, I wonder? I was looking at figures from the Office of National Statistics. More than 1 in 7 businesses still not trading at the moment. A quarter of businesses in food service or accommodation at severe or moderate risk of insolvency. I mean, he really stressed that this scheme will be supporting viable jobs, didn't he, this afternoon?
I think that is right. It's something that we're now having to come to terms with.